My name is Sabrina, and I was 30 years old when my aunt decided to erase my entire life with one sentence. It happened at our annual family lunch, the kind that took place in a perfectly trimmed suburban backyard, where the lawn looked too green to be real and the conversations were even more artificial. These lunches were never about connection, they were about measurement, about who had advanced, who had stalled, and who had quietly fallen behind. Every smile carried an evaluation. Every compliment hid a comparison. I arrived already tired, not just physically but emotionally. The past few weeks had been relentless, and I wanted, just once, to exist without explaining myself. That was why I dressed the way I did. No statement pieces, no designer bag, no visible clues. Just jeans, a soft neutral sweater, and my phone placed face down beside my plate, like an object of no importance. I did that on purpose. Because I knew Linda. My Aunt Linda had always been a performer. She spoke louder when more people listened. She laughed harder when attention drifted. Her sense of self was built entirely on how others saw her, and by extension, how inferior she could make someone else feel. To her, success wasn't something you lived, it was something you displayed. A corner office, a fixed schedule, a job title that could be announced without explanation. Anything outside that narrow frame didn't just confuse her, it offended her. Throughout the meal, I stayed quiet while conversations bounced around the table. Someone mentioned a promotion. Another bragged about buying a second property. Linda nodded approvingly at each story, storing them like trophies she could reference later. I watched her do it, the way her eyes sharpened when she sensed a hierarchy forming. I tried to keep my focus on my food, on the clink of silverware, on the safe topics. But Linda's attention drifted toward me slowly, deliberately, like a spotlight warming up. Halfway through the meal, she leaned back in her chair, smiled with practiced sweetness, and spoke just loudly enough for everyone to hear. "So, Sabrina, are you still jobless?" She paused, then added with a light laugh, "Or just enjoying being lazy these days?" The world seemed to stop. Forks froze. Conversations collapsed into silence. Even the birds felt quieter. Heat rushed to my face so fast it made my ears ring. Not because the words were true, but because she wanted them to be. Because she had rehearsed that moment. Because humiliation to her was a form of entertainment. She didn't stop there. Linda continued, glancing around the table for validation. She's 30 and still doesn't have a real job. Lives off her laptop, no office, no stability. She shrugged theatrically. You know how kids are these days. Kids. The word landed harder than the insult itself. It stripped away my age, my experience, my effort, reducing me to something unserious, unformed, undeserving of respect. I felt anger flare in my chest, sudden and sharp, like a spark hitting dry wood. But beneath that anger was something deeper, heavier. Pain. The kind that comes from recognizing a familiar pattern. From realizing that this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was intentional. Linda didn't misunderstand my life. She rejected it. My quiet way of moving through the world threatened her belief that only one kind of success deserved recognition. And rather than question that belief, she chose to attack me. I saw it clearly then. She needed me to be small so she could feel secure. My hands tightened around my fork. I felt my pulse in my throat. Part of me wanted to defend myself, to list facts, to correct the narrative she had just carved into the air. Another part wanted to disappear entirely, to let the moment pass without becoming a spectacle. I opened my mouth to speak. And that's when my phone vibrated beside my plate. The sound was soft, almost polite, but it cut through the silence like a blade. I glanced down at the screen, my breath catching as the glow reflected faintly off the table. Whatever it was, it arrived at the exact moment my life had just been publicly reduced to nothing. The screen lit up. Incoming call, EXCCLEDERSHIP. IV review. For a split second, everything inside me went silent. Then my heart skipped so hard it felt like it hit my ribs. My breath caught, shallow and fast, as if my body recognized the importance of the moment before my mind fully caught up. This was the call. Not a casual check-in, not a reschedule-friendly chat. This was the one we had locked into calendars weeks in advance, negotiated across time zones, carved out of packed schedules. 6 senior leaders. 3 countries. A live strategic review that determined the next phase of a company I had built from nothing but stubborn belief and long nights. The kind of meeting you didn't ignore unless something was truly wrong. Around me, the lunch table still hummed with awkward silence, thick with the residue of Linda's words. I could feel eyes darting toward my phone, curiosity mixing with judgment. Linda noticed it too. She always noticed anything that shifted attention away from her. She leaned forward slightly, lips curling into a knowing smirk. "Oh, what's that?" she said, voice dripping with Fox concern. "Another freelance gig falling through." A few people chuckled, uncertain whether they were supposed to. The pain sharpened instantly, not loud, not dramatic, just precise. Like a blade finding the same old wound. For a heartbeat, I considered doing what I had always done, muting myself, declining the call, stepping away to preserve the fragile piece of the table. But then something unexpected happened. The pain didn't spread. It stopped. And in its place, something steadier took root. Hope. Not the naive kind. Not the wishful thinking that things might magically improve. This was grounded, earned hope, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when others don't. I picked up the phone. "Give me 1 second, I said calmly, my voice surprising even me with its steadiness. Linda watched closely, clearly expecting me to stand up, to retreat somewhere discreet, to keep my supposed embarrassment hidden. Instead, I did the opposite. My thumb moved with quiet intention, tapping a single button. Speaker. The sound of the call connecting seemed louder than it should have been, echoing across the patio. A breeze rustled the tablecloth. Someone shifted in their chair. The moment stretched, thin and electric. Then a voice came through. Clear, confident, unmistakably professional. "Hi Sabrina," the man said warmly. "We're all on. Ready when you are, Director." The word hit the air like thunder. Director. Not whispered. Not qualified. Not explained. Just stated. Clean and unquestioned. I felt it resonate through me, grounding me in a way no defense ever could. Across the table, faces changed. Brows furrowed. Someone blinked twice, as if checking whether they'd heard correctly. Linda laughed, sharp and sudden, a reflex rather than amusement. "Director of what?" she asked, though her voice wavered slightly now, missing its earlier confidence. I didn't look at her. I didn't owe her an answer, not yet, not here. "Yes," I said into the phone, my tone even, controlled, unmistakably present. "I'm here, go ahead." As soon as the words left my mouth, I felt the shift, not just around the table, but inside myself. The tightness in my shoulders eased. My hands, which I hadn't realized were clenched, relaxed. This wasn't an act. This wasn't bravado. This was simply me stepping into a space I occupied every day, one that had nothing to do with Linda's understanding or approval. On the other end of the line, I could hear subtle sounds. Papers moving, keyboards clicking, a muted greeting from another voice waiting their turn. The rhythm was familiar, professional, real. It anchored me completely in the present. Around me, no one spoke. The family lunch had paused entirely, suspended between assumption and reality. Linda's smile had frozen, her eyes flicking from my phone to my face, searching for something. Confusion, perhaps, or a crack she could exploit. She didn't find one. I sat there, phone resting on the table, voice steady, posture relaxed, letting the call exist exactly as it was meant to. Unfiltered, uninterrupted, undeniable. For the first time that afternoon, I wasn't being measured. I was being heard. "Perfect," Mark said, his voice crisp and unhurried. "Before we start, quick confirmation. Are we proceeding with the acquisition under your authorization?" The question landed with the weight of something official, something irreversible. It wasn't framed as a suggestion, it wasn't deferred to anyone else. It assumed my authority as a given, as the final checkpoint before a decision that would move real money, real people, real consequences. Before I could respond, another voice joined the call. Also, Rachel, our legal lead, added smoothly, "The board approved the expansion this morning. Congratulations, by the way." The word board rippled through the table like a disturbance in still water. My aunt's smile froze mid-expression, her lips slightly parted, her eyes locked on my phone, as if it had suddenly become dangerous. The confidence she'd worn so comfortably only minutes earlier drained away, replaced by something brittle and uncertain. Around us, forks hovered in midair. Someone's glass stopped halfway to their mouth. Conversations didn't just fade, they died completely, as if everyone instinctively understood that interrupting this moment would be a mistake. Linda leaned forward, her chair scraping faintly against the stone patio. "Sabrina," she said slowly, lowering her voice in a way that suggested concern but couldn't quite hide the edge of panic beneath it. "What is this?" For the first time since she'd spoken my name like a verdict earlier that afternoon, I turned fully toward her. "I run a company," I said. My voice was quiet, but it didn't waver. There was no need for volume. The words themselves carried enough weight. "I founded it 4 years ago," I continued, meeting her eyes steadily. "I lead a remote executive team. We specialize in data infrastructure for healthcare networks. No embellishment, no defensive explanation, just truth, delivered cleanly." Silence followed, thick, uncomfortable, undeniable. On the other end of the call, Mark kept going, blissfully unaware of the audience that now hung on every word. "Just to confirm," he said, businesslike as ever, "Sabrina is the final decision maker. She's the director and majority stakeholder." Director. Majority stakeholder. Each title stripped away another layer of the story Linda had built about me. Each word quietly dismantled the version of me she had presented to the table as fact. I felt the pain in my chest loosen, as if a long-held tension had finally been released. But in its place rose something else, hotter, steadier, more controlled. Anger, yes, but non-explosive. This was anger that had been waiting patiently, shaped by years of being underestimated, dismissed, spoken over. Linda's mouth opened, then closed. You never said," she began, grasping for something to regain control of the moment. "You never asked," I said. The interruption wasn't sharp, it didn't need to be, it was precise. "You told people who I was instead." The words hung between us, impossible to ignore. I watched the realization settle over her face, not all at once, but in fragments. Confusion gave way to discomfort. Discomfort shifted into something like exposure. In that instant, her motivation became painfully clear to me in a way it never had before. She hadn't been curious about my life because curiosity would have required openness. And openness would have forced her to confront a truth she didn't want to face. That the world she understood, where success followed predictable paths and authority belonged to those who announced it loudly, was no longer the only one that mattered. She needed me beneath her, not out of cruelty alone, but out of fear. Fear that her choices weren't as secure as she pretended. Fear that adaptability had become more valuable than certainty. Fear that someone like me, quiet, unflashy, unapologetically different, could thrive without the structure she relied on. Around the table, people shifted in their seats. I could feel perspectives adjusting in real time. The narrative had changed, and with it, the way I was being seen. On the phone, Rachel cleared her throat gently. "Sabrina," she said, "do you want us to pause until you're in a more private setting?" I glanced down at the screen, then back at the table, at Linda, at the faces that had watched me be reduced, and now watched that reduction unravel. "No," I said calmly. "This is fine." And it was. Because for the first time, the truth wasn't something I had to defend. It was simply unfolding, out loud, in real time, where everyone could hear it. Linda tried to recover, her voice tentative, clipped at the edges. "Well, I just meant." I know what you meant, I said, my tone calm, deliberate and unyielding. And now everyone else does too. The words were small, but they carried weight. Not a shout, not a spectacle, just precision. They hung in the air between us, heavy enough to tilt the room, to shift the balance of attention and authority. My mother's eyes widened, her hand pausing midair as she reached for her glass. There was something in her gaze, recognition, surprise, maybe even awe. She had always quietly supported me, but now she was witnessing the unmasking of a narrative she had never questioned, but had observed unfold. The version of me that Linda had presented to the world, the version she had tried to keep invisible. My cousins, normally chatty, self-important, eager to insert themselves into the adult conversations, exchanged quick, startled glances. Their eyes said it all. This lunch, designed to reinforce familial hierarchy, had just collapsed. The careful scaffolding of judgments, whispers, and assumptions had come down in a single, unobtrusive revelation. No one spoke, everyone felt it. The table, once alive with polite chatter, now existed in suspended motion. Forks hovered mid-bite. Glasses trembled slightly in half-held hands. Even the distant hum of the air conditioner seemed to retreat, leaving only the raw clarity of the moment. For the first time in years, Linda had no anchor, no narrative, no audience that would unconditionally support her story. The authority she relied upon, the quiet, unquestioned understanding that she defined the rules of adult life, had evaporated. On the phone, Rachel, ever professional but unable to mask the amusement in her voice, laughed softly. Sabrina, should we pause? Sounds like you're in the middle of something. No, I said, steady, measured. This is fine. The simplicity of the answer underscored the control I now held over the room. It wasn't theatrics. It wasn't posturing. It was fact. I had created, led, and now commanded authority in a space that extended beyond the assumptions Linda had tried to force on me. Linda's composure faltered visibly. Her mouth opened and closed several times, as though she were rehearsing a retort that would never feel sufficient. She finally excused herself, her retreat quiet, understated. No slamming of doors. No parting shot to reclaim dignity. Just a slow, deliberate withdrawal, the kind that carries more weight than any raised voice. Her absence was louder than her words had ever been. As the patio fell into an odd stillness, I noticed something remarkable. The triumph was not the kind I had imagined in private fantasies. It wasn't explosive, celebratory, or vindictive. There were no gasps of astonishment, no applause, no declarations of victory. And yet it was complete. The collapse of Linda's story, her version of me, was not loud, but it was absolute. The room had shifted without a single shout. My presence, my truth, my authority had carved space in real time, unassailable, undeniable. I leaned back slightly, letting my hands rest on the table, eyes briefly scanning the faces still watching. Relief, respect, surprise, confusion. Each emotion flickered across the familiar features of my family, none of which could undo what had just occurred. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to explain further. My truth had spoken louder than any argument, any explanation, any desperate insistence from Linda could ever have. The triumph wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Because for the first time, the narrative wasn't hers. It was mine. It had always been mine. And now, finally, everyone could see it. When the call ended, the world outside that small patio seemed to shift, as though the afternoon had reset itself in subtle, irrevocable ways. People began approaching me one by one. Some brought apologies carefully phrased, like fragile glass sliding across the table. Others asked questions, genuine curiosity finally unfiltered by assumptions. A few offered congratulations, tentative but sincere, the kind that only comes when respect is suddenly earned rather than assumed. I answered them all with measured patience. No triumphal gestures, no performances of superiority. Just acknowledgement. The weight of years spent being misjudged, dismissed, or underestimated had been replaced with clarity. I realized that respect isn't demanded. It's recognized when truth aligns with presence. Even my mother, usually reserved in her expressions, lingered near me, eyes softened, her fingers brushing a napkin absently. She didn't need to say anything. The glance alone conveyed what had long been silent: recognition, pride, and relief that I had claimed the space I was always meant to occupy. The family dynamics that had governed these lunches for decades, carefully curated hierarchies, the unspoken competitions, the assumptions about who was successful and who was not, had shifted in a way that couldn't be reversed. Linda, the orchestrator of so much judgment and smallness, had retreated. Her presence, once loud and defining, had become background noise. The collapse of her narrative was subtle but absolute, and the room had absorbed it without ceremony. Hours later, after the last guest had left and the house had returned to its quieter rhythm, my phone buzzed. One message, from Linda. "I didn't know, I'm sorry." I stared at it for a long time. The words sat on the screen like a fragile bridge between the past and whatever came next. The temptation to respond sharply, to say something cutting, was brief but present. I could have marked victory in any number of ways: through gloating, through dismissal, through a public reminder of the day's events. Instead, I chose stillness. I let the message exist for a moment longer, weighed it, measured it, and then typed a response. "You didn't want to know. That's the difference." Simple, direct, precise. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't performative. It wasn't about humiliation or pointing out her flaws. It was a recognition of truth, of intention, of the choices she had made over years of assuming she could define me without understanding me. I didn't block her. I didn't delete the message. I didn't need to escalate or assert further dominance. The justice of the day had already been served, not in anger, not in spectacle, but in fact, in clarity, in authority, in being present exactly as I was. Because that is what justice actually looks like: not a public shaming, not a display of superiority, not revenge disguised as accomplishment. Justice is the quiet, undeniable truth being heard. Justice is presence, authenticity, and the reclamation of space that has always been yours, even if others refuse to acknowledge it. I put the phone down, leaning back in the chair, letting the stillness wash over me. The house was quiet. My family, forever altered by the day's revelations, was beginning to adjust to the new reality. And I realized, fully and deeply, that sometimes the most powerful moment in your life isn't when you prove someone wrong. It's when you realize you were never small to begin with. That understanding, calm and complete, felt heavier, fuller, and infinitely more satisfying than any applause could ever have been. No one had cheered. No one had clapped. And yet, in the quiet, the victory was absolute. I had spoken the truth. I had lived the truth. And in that, I had acclaimed something far greater than recognition. I had claimed myself.